Hello dear chess friends, in this video we'll take a look at a very recent idea. It was played by no other than the world champion Magnus Carlsen in the FIDE World Cup, and it's quite a remarkable idea. Let's take a closer look immediately. It starts with white, it's e4, and it's against the Sicilian defense, and it's in a variation with bishop b5 check. Of course, black has many moves like knight c6, bishop d7, but knight d7 became recently the main line. And Magnus Carlsen played d4, which is not a surprise yet. And here the most common response is c takes d4. And now the huge majority of games continues with queen takes d4. And Magnus Carlsen played knight takes d4. And this looks rather strange, because now we have some sort of mixture between the open Sicilian and the bishop b5 variation of the Sicilian. And usually in the open Sicilian, the bishop on b5 doesn't make a good impression. In many variations, probably the most famous one is the knight of defense, where black plays a6 anyway. And if, for example, if we would play knight gf6 and now continue without any big idea, just to play knight e3 and black would play a6, we have to retreat the bishop and black would be a complete tempo up compared to a normal knight of defense. So obviously white has to have something very concrete in mind to justify this idea to mix the bishop b5 variation with the open Sicilian. And here comes the really remarkable idea that was played by Magnus Carlsen in the World Cup, and it was castling. White doesn't defend the pawn on e4 and just castles. Knight takes e4 is extremely bad, because white would just go rook e1. The knight on e4 is hanging. What could black do? If he goes back with knight f6, we just play knight f5, and it's amazing how quickly black could get into huge trouble, because there's simply no way to stop knight takes d6. And white is already winning by this point. Instead of knight ef6 back, there's also one idea maybe to keep the knight in the center by pushing d5. But white again tries to open the position, and after c4, knight f6 back, knight f5 follows. Again, knight d6 is a threat, and after e6, white can take on d5, and once again black is completely lost. So we see that knight takes e4 is not working at all, which is already pretty good news. And now let's take a look at what options black has. We'll start with the minor options. I will tell you right away that a6 is the very best move here. But before we take a look at a6, let's see what is white's idea if black just finishes his development, for example, by playing e6. He will play rook e1, protecting the e4 pawn with the rook and clearing the way for the bishop. The bishop can retreat to f1. So for example, after a6 we play bishop f1, and once again it might look like a normal open Sicilian, but there's a huge difference, and the difference is that the knight remained on b1. And with the knight remaining on b1, black doesn't have his usual counterplay along the c-file. First of all, a move like b5 is not good at all, because white would just attack the b5 pawn by going a4, forcing black to decide what to do. Of course, after ba4, white will be always slightly better, a6 will be just weak. And after b4, things might even get worse, because white just plays c3, and after bc3, knight c3, white has basically all the advantages that he usually has in these open Sicilians. Like he has pawn majority on the queen side, d6 pawn could be weak, while on the other hand black doesn't have his usual counterplay along the c-file, because there's simply no pawn on c2 anymore. And let's take a look what else black could do. Black could play normal developing move like bishop e7, but now white will set up some hedgehog structures with pawns e4 and c4 and get a very broad center, and this is usually avoided by the black players in the Sicilian defense. Very similar idea is employed by white after g6. White once again goes rook e1, protects e4, and is ready to retreat the bishop. For example, if bishop g7, white will just play bishop f1, and after castling, white goes c4, setting up the typical Magochi structure. The knight will go to c3, bishop will go to e3, and one day white's idea will be to prepare knight d5, because the knight on d5 will be very annoying in such structures, because if black takes on d5, white has a huge space advantage and can consider both ed5 or cd5 depending on the circumstances. And on the other hand, black can never kick a knight from d5 by going e6, because this would weaken the d6 pawn a lot. So black is really in the trouble in general in all these Magochi structures. Therefore, black should aim to avoid this. Besides the move a6, black could also try the move e5. After e5, our idea is to go knight f5. We have to make immediate use of the strong bishop on b5 in connection with our lead in development. And once again, we have to take a look what happens if black takes the pawn on e4. White has many good options. First of all, he can play rook e1, and after a6, bishop a4, we transpose to a line that will take a closer look in the a6 lines. But besides this, white has the option of going queen g4, attacking both the knight on e4 and the pawn on g7, regaining the material immediately, and the move that would be my recommendation for you, and the move that sets the most problems, it's queen d5. The knight on e4 is already hanging. Knight f6 back will be simply answered by taking on d6, and after bishop d6, queen d6, queen e7, taking on e7, taking on e7. It's not really an important position from a theoretical standpoint, but I still would like to draw your attention to it, because at first sight it might look like things are not so terrible for black. Of course, white has the pair of bishops, but on the other hand it's the same material, the queens are off the board. But actually our bishops are extremely strong and our attack will continue even with the queens off the board. For example, after the move b3, our idea will be bishop a3, followed by knight d2, knight c4 and knight d6 check eventually. And black's position is already collapsing. I think the engine shows around +3 already at this point, so it's really a huge advantage for white, and the pair of bishops can be extremely strong even with the queens exchanged. And after queen d5, there's the option for black to try to include a6. Here we of course play bishop c4, double attacking f7 and the knight on e4. But black still has the defense. Black has the defense of going queen f6, attacking the knight on f5. And the huge point of black's idea is that after queen e4, black has knight c5. Now the bishop on c8 is also attacking the knight, so therefore we are forced to give back the knight on g7. And after queen g7, queen e2, bishop h3, it looks like that black now gets some counterattack, but we have an extremely strong idea. We have bishop d5, the ideal square for the bishop, protecting g2, and it's very hard to challenge this bishop on d5. And if black continues to increase the attack with rook g8, we simply go g3. Black is forced to take, we recapture, and the bishop on d5 is such a monster that just by this bishop, white already has fantastic compensation. And objectively, the computer assesses this position even slightly better for white, while I think in a practical game, it will be even a bigger advantage for white. So once again, capturing on e4 was not to be recommended. Black should play here a6, when after bishop a4, we will transpose to a line that we'll take a look at in a minute. So we can already, we already saw all other options. It's time to see the main move a6. And here we play bishop a4. The only move that is, gives white idea any sense. And once again, black has a wide variety of moves. Let's continue with e5 because it's the line that we just saw. After e5, we once again play knight f5. And after knight e4, now there comes an extremely important move. And this move is c4. It stops b5, it controls d5. And therefore ensures that our bishop can stay on a4, pressurizing on the diagonal a4, e8, as well as the bishop has some chances to return to c2. The main move, or the most logical move here, would be g6, kicking our knight. And here we play knight e3. And our knight on e3 is ideally placed, it controls d5. Bishop g7 is a bit of a, maybe this move is a bit too early for black, because after bishop g7 we have queen d5. And black gets some problems with the knight on e4. If he protects the knight with f5, then we just exchange it by going knight c3. And hereby once again increase the pressure on the weak d6 pawn. We'll follow up with bishop a3. And black is already in huge trouble. Things are not any better if black retreats the knight. He can go back to f6 when we just capture the pawn. And once again, queen e7 doesn't really give black much of a relief, because after queen e7, king e7, once again b3 will follow and black will be in huge trouble. While after knight ec5, we can even sacrifice the bishop on a4, because after queen d6, knight a4, we have knight d5, and the threat of knight c7 gives white already a winning position. So we see that after g6, knight e3, the most logical move, bishop g7 doesn't make much sense, so black should go probably bishop e7, while f5 would be another option. And here after knight d5, castling, we play bishop h6. Once again, the bishop is very nicely placed, and it's useful to put the rook to e8, and here we can return bishop e3, keeping the idea of bishop d7 and knight b6. It was quite important to provoke the rook to e8, because now on this diagonal we have much more pressure. And in general, this whole position is still very new. So this position after e5, knight f5, knight e4, c4, still a very new position, a very fresh position. There are many options. One computer idea is rook b8. And we could analyze this or talk about this for a whole hour, make our own DVD on this position if we want to, because it's really an interesting one. But since it's so fresh, I encourage you just to take a look yourself, or to simply employ it, try it over the board. It will be a very, it should be a lot of fun to play such a position, especially with the white pieces. Let's take a look at other options. One option that wasn't available at move 6, it's b5. And here we retreat the bishop, of course, to b3, and our next move will be a4. Basically on any move that black is about to play. May it be g6, e6, bishop b7, against all those moves, we will answer with a4. And it's important once again that our knight is still on b1, which is a huge advantage in all these open Sicilians. The only move that sort of stops a4 would be knight c5. But here we play bishop d5, forcing the exchange on d5. And after bishop b7, threatening bishop d5, we are in time to push a4 anyways. The point is that knight a4 will be answered by c4, and black again is completely undeveloped on the king side, and white's initiative is slowly growing. Knight e4, once again a move that should be considered. After rook e1, knight f6 runs into similar problems as we saw without the inclusion of a6, bishop a4. Knight f5 is again a very strong answer. A good alternative would be c4 as well. And if black goes knight ec5, here we see that the inclusion of a6 was quite useful for black, because now knight c5 comes with tempo. Here we'll just mention that c4 is our move that we're supposed to play, protecting our bishop, stopping b5, and keeping pressure on this diagonal. And after e6, we reach again a very interesting position, which will be covered from another move order. And before we see the main move e6, let's take a look what happens if black goes g6. Once again, we have to set up a Maroczy structure, otherwise our whole setup will not make too much sense. So we go c4. And here after bishop g7, knight c3, castles, and for example h3, with the idea to go bishop e3 one day. Of course, it's not as good as with rook e1 and the bishop on f1, because the bishop on a4 can be more easy being target. But on the other hand, still, this Maroczy structure is so good that even with the bishop on a4, which is slightly misplaced, white's position is still very good. Let's see it a bit more concrete. After queen c7, we play bishop b3, and after knight c5, attacking the pawn on e4, we just go rook e1. And I want to briefly talk about the position arising after knight takes b3 and a b3. Now we have doubled pawns, but actually these doubled pawns are a huge improvement, because usually in the Maroczy structure we will need b3 one day to cover our pawn on c4. But usually once we play b3, we'll get problems on the long diagonal. But now with these doubled p-pawns, we have one pawn that protects our knight and one pawn that protects our c4 pawn. So these double pawns are extremely useful. Additionally, we have a half-open a-file where some tactics could arise one day. So this is actually a huge improvement over the normal structure with the pawns on b3 and a2. Of course, black isn't forced to take on b3. He could try something concrete like going e5, but here we play knight c2. And once again, our idea is knight b4, bishop g5, and fighting for the very important d5 square, where we would like to put the knight one day. So we see that even if black plays slowly, this Maroczy structure is not as good as the one that we saw some minutes ago, but it's still quite favorable for white. Once again, we have to take a look what happens if black captures on e4, and once again it's rather bad because we play rook e1. Black has, as usual, two ways to retreat the knight. He can go to f6, and here we play bishop f4. Very strong move, threatening bishop d6, and after e6 we would just play knight c3, and black is already in a huge dilemma. He cannot finish the development, the king stays in the center, because bishop g7 is not possible due to the fact that d6 is always weak, and bishop e7 will be answered by bishop h6. And once again, black cannot castle. And if black tries something more concrete like e5, once again knight c3 comes, white finishes his development. White is not afraid of bishop e7. Bishop h6 would follow, black can not castle, and after e takes d4, queen d4, white sacrificed the piece, but black is completely out of moves. Queen f6 is a threat. The knight from f6 cannot move. Knight d5 is a threat. The king is stuck in the center. The knight on d7 cannot move. So black is really in huge trouble. And if black goes b5, we can simply sacrifice one more piece, and after bishop b5, the same problems remain. Black is completely tied up and objectively lost. After knight e3, bishop g7 looks like the best move, because black is about to castle, but here white has a very nice tactical resource. If you want to stop the video, take a look, try to find it yourself. And it's really an amazing move. It's knight c6. And after bc6, queen d6 follows. Bishop e5 is in the air, as well as taking the pawn on c6. And after queen e7, black manages to castle, but the price for this castling is the whole rook on a8, and white is material up and completely winning. So black could play knight ec5, but here we just play bishop g5. And after knight a4, queen a4, black has similar problems. He cannot develop the bishop from f8 because it has to protect the pawn on e7. And if he tries to kick our bishop from g5 by going h6 and g5, we have knight f5, and our usual threat of knight d6 secures white a nice advantage. Let's see the main move after bishop e4, and also the one that was played in the Carlsen game. And very interesting, one day later, Peter Svidler already took up the idea of Magnus Carlsen and played the same line with white. His opponent, Vityugov, played the same way. They played e6. We already know we want to set up the Maroczy structure by going c4. And just for the record, I will mention one more time, knight takes e4 really runs into huge problems. Here we go rook e1. After knight f6 back, white is already sacrificing a whole rook by going rook e6, f e6, knight e6. The queen has to go somewhere to cover the c7 square, so b6 or a5 come into consideration. After queen b6, we just go bishop e3. Black is forced to play queen a5, still cover the c7 square. Here we go bishop d2, and after queen b6, we can play queen e1. The advantage of this bishop e3, bishop d2 idea is that also after queen a5, we can go for the same position, play bishop d2 and queen b6, queen e1. Queen e1 is very important because first of all, we are threatening a discovery check with the knight on e6. And secondly, we have the option of going bishop a5. And yeah, this mixture is putting black in front of unsolvable problems. In the notes, you will see some more variations and how white is completely winning by now. As usual, there's also the other retreat with the knight ec5, and here we just play knight c3. And after bishop e7, we have one very important moment. Also, you can take a look and think along, try to find what could be the best way for white to continue. And the move is bishop takes d7. Because there's no good way for black to recapture on d7. By capturing on d7 with any other piece than the knight, b4 will follow and the knight on c5 will get lost. And if the knight takes on d7, then rook e6 will come. F e6 is complete suicide, knight e6 would follow, and after queen a5, knight d5, and these two knights are so strong that white is already completely winning. There's simply no way to cover all those threats. And if after rook e6, a normal developing move like castle will be answered by rook e1. The pawn on d6 is terribly weak. White is once again clearly better. And black has an interesting idea by going knight e5, winning the exchange. But again, white gets tremendous compensation in form of knight d5. And after queen d8, another important move is f4, indirectly protecting the c4 pawn. And after knight c6, black also loses the right to castle after queen e2 check. And white's compensation is fantastic. And especially in a practical game, I would pick white any day a week. Now we come to the best move, and this is bishop e7. Here we play knight c3, castles queen e2, and queen c7. So both sides finished their development, and this was also the way the Carlsen game went, and the same way was also like Svidler played. And here both of them played the move f4. And although it's a very good practical try, you can see these two games, they're also in the notes. They are very interesting for white, and I definitely recommend you to try out this f4 move yourself. But there's a small issue. After knight b6, bishop b3, black has the improvement on those games by going bishop d7. And the idea of bishop d7 is simply to continue attacking c4 by going rook c8. If white tries to protect c4 by going knight c2, rook c8, knight e3, here black can play bishop c6, attacking the pawn on e4, and it's really not so easy for white to cover this pawn, because by going bishop c2, black will again focus on the other pawn, the c4 pawn, and go bishop e8. And it's really, not so easy to prove or to find good ideas for white here, although it's still there's room, you can try to find something. But because of this, I want to recommend another way, a very similar way, because also the move that I want to recommend you, it was later on played, like later in those games. And the move is king h1. It has the advantage that still we keep the idea of f4, but we keep our f-pawn flexible. And if black plays in the same most crucial way by going knight b6, bishop b3, bishop d7, we go knight c2, we need to cover c4. And after rook c8, knight e3, if bishop c6 comes, we have a good way of protecting the pawn on e4 simply by going f3, and we'll finish our development with bishop d2. And once again, we achieve this Maroczy hedgehog structure, and white enjoys a nice advantage. So in my opinion, this king h1 move, it's a clear improvement on the games of Svidler and Carlsen, and I wish you a lot of fun trying it out, many points, and enjoy the line. I think the stronger your opponents will be, the more likely it is that you will reach the following position after queen c7, because in many top games this was reached. While probably if you play weaker opponents, you have good chances that they might grab the e4 pawn very greedy at some point, or even deviate early on and don't even find the best move, a6 here, and you will get a very good position right away. Keep in mind that our idea was rook e1, followed by bishop f1 and setting up the Maroczy or the hedgehog structure. So thank you for your attention, for watching this interesting line with me. I'm also looking forward to employ it in my games, and I hope you will do the same, and we will score many nice victories for white from this line. Thank you. Goodbye.